Hey guys, what's going on? It's Dave from Evil Eye Games. In this video, I'm going to go ahead and add sprinting functionality to our character. So the first thing we're going to have to do, same as always, is add an input. So we're going to go to our project settings, and in inputs, we're going to add a new action mapping. And I'm simply going to call this the sprint button. And then we're going to have to assign it a button. So I'm going to look at the shift button, and I'm going to make it the left shift button. And one thing I forgot to do before was add a controller button for the crouch as well. So we're going to add a new button to each one of these crouch and sprint buttons. And for the crouch button, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set it to a gamepad, and we're going to use the face button. I'm going to select for crouch the face button right. And on an Xbox 360 controller, that would be the B button. And on a PlayStation controller, that would be the circle button. And then under sprint button here, I'm going to set this to the gamepad bottom button. If I can find it, the gamepad face button bottom. So that would be the A button, or on a PlayStation controller, it would be an X button. So now we have our buttons set up. I'm going to go ahead and close our project settings. And we're going to open up our player character. Next thing we have to do is call upon our event. So in an empty space in the graph here, we're going to search for our sprint button. And I'm going to set it so that the player has to hold the button down in order to sprint. And we want to be able to track that we want to sprint. So we're going to have to create a new variable. So on the left, under my blueprint, under variables, to the right, there's a plus variable button. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And we're going to call this variable is sprinting. And we want to make sure that the type is Boolean. So if you click on the little icon to the left of the variable, it'll give you a drop down and you can select the variable type. Here I'm going to set it to Boolean. So it should be the little red icon. And we want to go ahead and set this. And a fun little trick with variables, while I'm at it, is if you hold Control on the keyboard before you click and drag out a variable, it will automatically perform a get. And if you hold Alt and drag out onto the graph, it will grab a set for you. So we want to set this variable. So from our press button, I'm going to go ahead and drag out and connect from pressed to set is sprinting. And when we press the button down, we want to set it to true. And when we release, we want to set it to false. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the set, plug the released into set is sprinting that we just created. And from the press one, I want to make sure that is sprinting is checked to true. And from the released, is sprinting is set to false. The next thing I want to address here is how to handle sprinting from a crouched position and how we're going to handle that. Now, I want it to, when you start sprinting, uncrouch the character. So from our set is sprinting true, I'm going to drag out and we're going to search for our uncrouch. And I'm going to connect that up. So when we go ahead and press the sprint button, it's going to set us to sprinting, and it's going to uncrouch our character. When we let go, it's going to set sprinting to false. But we still have to do something where we go ahead and actually alter the movement speed of the character. So in order to do this, I'm going to actually create a function, because this function will be useful for more than just our sprinting. So to the left here under my blueprint, there's a function section. And there's a button that says plus function. I'm going to click on that. And it's going to create a new function for us. And we can go ahead and name it. And I'm going to call this update movement speed. And I want to have this being a multi-purpose function. So later on, we can use it for more stuff. But for now, all we need to do is to have it to check to see if we're sprinting. So I'm going to go ahead and put a branch into our tree here. And you can right click and search for branch, and it will produce a a node that looks like this. Alternatively, if you want a quick way to add a branch to the graph, you can hold the B button down on the keyboard and left click, and it will produce a branch as well. So I only need one branch. We're going to connect our input to this branch, and we want to go ahead and check to see if we're sprinting. So I'm going to connect is sprinting to the condition. And next, we're going to have to call upon our character movement component because we want to modify the maximum movement speed within the character movement. The character movement doesn't have a built-in sprinting type of functionality. So all we're going to have to do is manually adjust the maximum speed that the character can move at. So from our components tab up here, I'm going to left click and drag out from the character movement component. And this is going to give us a reference to our character movement component. And all this bubble essentially does is point to that component. So we can request things of that specific component or tell that specific component to do something. So from our character movement component here, we're going to drag out and we're going to search for set max walk speed. And this will allow us to adjust the maximum walk speed within the character movement component. And I'm going to duplicate this because we're going to need one for true and one for false. And I'm going to plug in the true to one and the false to other. And we want to make sure to connect the character movement reference into the target on the new one that we created. So both of these targets are filled out on the sets. And we're going to have to set the speed here. So if sprinting is true, I'm going to set the maximum walk speed to 750. And if it's false, I want to set it back down to our normal walk speed, which is 500. And that's going to complete our function. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. We will definitely come back to the update movement speed when we add further movement functionality. But for the meantime, all we have to do to call on this is drag it out from our functions on the left onto the graph. And we can go ahead and plug our uncrouch into this update movement speed. And the set is sprinting to false in there as well. And I'm going to add in a reroute node right here to make it look clean. And this is pretty much going to complete our sprint button. So when we press the sprint button, it's going to set is sprinting to true. It's going to uncrouch our character, and it's going to update our movement speed. When we release the key, it's going to set is sprinting to false, and then it's just going to update our movement speed for us. So I'm going to go ahead and put a comment box around this, and we're going to call this our sprint button. So at this point, I'm going to compile and save, and as always, we want to test this out to make sure it works right. So if I hit the play button, and I start moving forward, and I hit the shift button, he will start moving faster. He's not animating any differently because we haven't modified the anim blueprint yet, but he will definitely move faster when the sprint button is held. So let's go ahead and add in the animation for sprinting. So I'm going to open up our anim blueprint, and we're going to want to search in our asset browser here for our sprinting animation. And we'll find the sprint forward rifle animation. So I'm going to drag this onto the graph, and I'm just going to name this node sprinting. So we're going to have to create a transition, and I'm just going to create a transition from walking standing to sprinting and back. Because when we hit the sprint button, it's going to uncrouch our character, so he's already going to move up to the walking standing node. So that transition is already taken care of for us. So for the transitions here from walking standing to sprinting, I'm going to double click on this. And we don't have our is sprinting variable yet, so we're going to head over to our graph. And from our third person player character here, from the node, I'm going to drag out, and we are going to search for get is sprinting. And that's going to pull the value from our player character to see whether or not our character is sprinting. And then we're going to promote it to a variable so we can read it within the anim blueprint. And I'm just going to call this the same thing, is sprinting. And then we can just connect our set is crouched up to our set is sprinting. So now we have a variable to access that we can tell if the character wants to sprint or not. So if we go back over to our locomotion anim graph, we can go ahead and drag out and get is sprinting. But we don't want to just check if the character is sprinting, because remember, the variable only tracks if the player is pressing the button down. We also want to make sure that the character is moving. So I'm going to drag out from our speed here, and I'm going to get this. And we want to make sure our character is moving at least a certain speed in order to be able to sprint. And our blend space from the walking animation from before this is a maximum of 500. So I want to check to see if this is greater than 500. And we want to make this transition when both of these are true. So from our is sprinting, I'm going to drag out and search for an and Boolean. And I'm going to plug the greater than into the and as well, and plug the and into the result. So what it's doing here is it's checking to see is sprinting, if it's true, and if the speed we're moving at is greater than 500. If this is true, then we can go ahead and transition from our walking standing to the sprinting. So I'm going to back out, and we're going to address the transition from sprinting back to walking standing. So in this case, once again, we want to get is sprinting, but we want this to be false in order to make the transition. So I'm going to drag out and search for a not Boolean. But once again, we have another set of criterion where the character may not be sprinting if the speed falls too low. For example, if our character is sprinting forward and we let go of the move forward button, we also have to take our speed into account. So I want to go ahead and get our speed, and I want to see if this is less than, and we want to see if it's less than or equal to 500. Now, I want to make this transition if either one of these are true, not both of them. So from our is not sprinting, I'm going to drag out and search for an or Boolean. And we're going to plug our less than or equals into the or, and plug the result into, plug the or into the result pin here. So what we're performing here is we're checking to see, is sprinting false, or is our speed less than or equal to 500? If either one of these is the case, then we can go ahead and go back to our regular walking standing movement. So let's go ahead and compile and save this, and we'll test it out. So if we start moving our character around and I hit the shift button, he transitions over to the sprint animation. If I let go of the sprint button, he stops sprinting. So I'll start sprinting again. And if I let go of the forward movement key, he will stop sprinting. Now I'm still holding the sprint button down, but if I start moving again, he will transition back into the sprint. Now, another couple of things we have to take care of here is strafing. Now, if we're sprinting forward here, we can strafe left and right, and it doesn't really look right. And also, our mouse is just as sensitive when we're sprinting as when we're not. And I want to go ahead and change that to make it so that the mouse doesn't react as well, or at least the looking around does not react as quickly as when we're sprinting compared to when we're just regularly moving around and walking. So I'm going to back out of this, and we're pretty much done in the anim blueprint, so I'm going to close that, and we're going to go into our player character. So the first thing I want to address is the mouse movement, or the look around movement. So I'm going to go up here to our look inputs, and from our look yaw, we want to slow down the rate of rotation of the camera when we're sprinting. So we need to perform a check on this. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a branch, and we're going to connect our input access look yaw into the branch, and we're going to connect one input into an add controller yaw input, and I'm going to duplicate this as well. So we're going to connect one into the true and one into the false. Now the condition we want to check to see is if we're sprinting. So I'm just going to plug is sprinting into the branch. And I'll go ahead and make a reroute node here so our green line can make it around easy. So we're going to check is sprinting as true. If it's true, we want to modify this controller yaw input. And if it's false, we can just use the pure value from our look yaw. So what we need to do is I'm going to drag out from one of these reroute nodes, and I'm going to search for multiply, just the multiply star on the keypad. And we're going to search for the float times a float. And I'm going to plug the result into the value on the add controller yaw input of our true lead. And then we're going to add a value in here that we're going to multiply by. I'm going to set this to 0.25. And so what this is going to do is basically when we end up sprinting, if we're sprinting, it's just going to take the axis value of our mouse movement or look around movement, and it's going to quarter it. And I'm going to put another node in here for this, a reroute node, to make it easier to read. And I'm just going to expand the comment box here to fit around our look inputs, and this should work. So let's go ahead and compile and save, and we're going to hit play. So if I start sprinting with the character, my mouse input is actually dulled down quite a bit, as opposed to when I'm not sprinting. So there's that taken care of. Next, I want to take care of our movement. So I'm going to drag this look inputs out over to the side here. And for our movement input here, for getting rid of strafing, this is going to be really easy. All I'm going to do is put in a branch on our axis move right and plug the true input into add movement input. Now our condition we're going to get is sprinting, and we want to make sure that this is false. So I'm going to search for the not and a not Boolean and plug this into our condition. And I'll just clean up the graph a little bit here. So all we're doing essentially is when we read the input move right, it's going to check to see if we're not sprinting. If is sprinting is false, we're going to add movement input. And if is sprinting is true, we're just not going to do anything at all. So it's going to null out our move right. So we shouldn't be able to sprint, or we shouldn't be able to strafe while sprinting. So let's compile and save and test it out. So if I start sprinting and I use left and right, it is not going to strafe at all. Now, the last thing we want to take care of here is the forward and backward movement. So if I end up sprinting with a character and I sprint backwards, he'll play the sprinting animation while moving backwards. And I don't want that to happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to make some modifications to our move forward input. And what I want to do here is after we add our movement input, I want to go ahead and insert a branch. And we're going to connect our add movement input from our move forward. And we want to check to see what the value of this axis is. So I'm going to drag out from here and I'm going to search for a less than. And that was less than or equals. So let's try that again. We'll search for less than. And I'm going to set a value of, let's say, 0.5. And we also don't always want to run this check no matter what. So I'm going to get is sprinting. And I'm going to create an and Boolean right here. So I'm going to drag out and search for and Boolean. And we're going to connect our is sprinting and the less than check to our and Boolean. And then we're going to plug this into our branch. And then I'm just going to add a couple of reroute nodes in here to get this around our add movement so we can read it easier. And we're going to fire this when our input movement is less than 0.5 and we're sprinting. So basically what we want to do here is we want to set is sprinting to false. And we also want to update our movement speed. So if this is true, we're going to set is sprinting to false and update our movement speed. So what I'm doing here is after we add our movement input, it's going to check to see our forward movement. And if we drop to a value of less than 0.5 and we're sprinting, it is going to go ahead and set is sprinting to false, and it's going to go ahead and update our movement speed for us. So that is going to set it so that if we are using a gamepad and we roll our thumb off the stick and we are sprinting forward at the same time, it's going to unset the sprint for us. So let's compile and save and hit play. So if I go ahead and I move forward and I start sprinting and I let go of the sprint forward key, he stops sprinting. And one side effect of this is it's going to require the player to hit the sprint button to start sprinting again. However, if we move backwards and hit the sprint button, he is not going to sprint backwards. So I think this is a pretty fair trade-off for movement capabilities. And pretty much that's everything I wanted to get done for today. So if you guys have any questions or comments, you can go ahead and leave them down below. I'm also going to leave a link to my Facebook page in the description, so you can like me over there or whatever. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.